You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Chronic migraine is 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine before they start. It's not for those with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It prevents on average 8 to 9 headache days a month versus 6 to 7 for placebo.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Why wait? Ask your doctor, visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com, or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
Close your eyes, exhale, feel your body relax, and let go of whatever you're carrying today.
Well, I'm letting go of the worry that I wouldn't get my new contacts in time for this class. I got them delivered free from 1-800-CONTACTS. Oh my gosh, they're so fast.
And breathe.
Oh, sorry. I almost couldn't breathe when I saw the discount they gave me on my first order. Oh, sorry. Namaste.
Visit 1-800-CONTACTS.com today to save on your first order.
1-800-CONTACTS.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 271, War at Sea 41, part 9, Found and Followed. This week, a big thank you goes out to Landon for supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. On May 22nd, 1941, as the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen were making their run for the Denmark Strait, a very important conversation was happening, because Raeder was in a meeting with Hitler at Obersalzberg, and during that meeting he would inform Hitler of the ongoing operation. In the run-up to and at the start of the operation of the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen, Hitler had no idea what was happening. Raeder had complete control over the operational orders of the Kriegsmarine, and he simply did not want Hitler's feedback on the operation until it was already underway. Hitler expressed some concern, and the word agitated gets thrown around a bit for his reaction. Raeder did have on his side that Operation Berlin with the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had gone quite well, with the ships having returned after achieving their goal of sinking merchant ships. But Hitler was unconvinced, and even required that the Bismarck be recalled, but Raeder refused to issue such an order, stating that the operation was far too far along to be cancelled, and it would have a lasting impact on the morale of the German Navy, and so the operation must continue. On the other side of the operation, the resources of the Royal Navy were being positioned as best they could to prepare to meet the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen as they moved towards the Atlantic. The most urgent need was to spot the ships because their exact locations were needed before Admiral Tovey could commit his capital ships to a chase due to the possibility of fuel and range limitations, making it difficult to keep up with the German ships. When it came to finding the Bismarck, the most pivotal role would be played by the cruisers that were positioned along possible routes into the Atlantic, including the two under the command of Admiral Wake Walker, the Suffolk and the Norfolk. These cruisers, and the radar that they had mounted on them, were assigned to watch the Denmark Strait. Their goal was not to engage the Bismarck. That would have been suicidal. Instead, they would spot the German ships and then shadow them, and then they would provide constant updates on position, speed, and direction of travel to as many other people as possible in the Royal Navy. I might argue that there were few cruisers during the entirety of the Second World War and every Royal Navy action during that war that achieved their goals better than the Suffolk and the Norfolk between May 22nd and May 27th, 1941. All of the big guns on all of the British ships in the history of the Royal Navy could not have brought down the Bismarck if not for the actions of these two cruisers. While they would perform their jobs quite well, the men aboard the British cruisers were not thrilled with the idea that they would be monitoring the Denmark Strait, because it was a boring job. The Royal Navy kept a pretty constant watch on certain areas of the routes into the Atlantic, and that watch required ships to just kind of loiter for weeks at a time, in areas like the Denmark Strait. This was not a fun job. It was a boring job, punctuated only by horrible, miserable weather. One sailor would describe the interior of the cruisers during these loitering patrols as cold and humid like a tomb. And the county-class cruisers, like Suffolk and Norfolk, actually had it good because they were generally better in rough seas than some of the other smaller ships of the Royal Navy, and their interiors were generally warmer as well. But no amount of small comforts could make up for the challenges of the weather. And also, the ships weren't really designed for these type of patrols. One of the challenges faced by the Royal Navy was that it had to design its ships for service all over the world, with a single class of cruisers like the County class, sometimes having ships in the far north and on the equator at the same time. This meant that they were often optimized for work in warmer weathers, because that was the majority of the area in which cruisers would operate. They were designed to guard the vastness of the empire, not dodge ice in the Denmark Strait. But dodge the ice, the Suffolk and Norfolk would in May 1941. Generally, the two would work together, with one patrolling while the other made its way back to Iceland for resupply and a brief respite for the men on board, and then they would swap back and forth. On May 21st, the Suffolk would be relieved by the Norfolk for its trip back to Iceland. The Suffolk would then make its way into Iceland and complete its resupply and refuel operations, which were the first things done before setting down for a few days in port, but then news of the Bismarck arrived. Lieutenant Commander Collette, the Suffolk's air defense officer, would later write, quote, "We had just completed oiling and were beginning to settle down to our first evening meal in harbor for some considerable time, when we got our order to proceed as quickly as possible to patrol our old friend the Denmark Strait in company with the HMS Norfolk." The Suffolk's captain, Ellis, assumed that the instructions that he would be given would be to do exactly what they had been planning for basically the entire war. The cruisers would try and make contact with any ships moving through the Denmark Strait. They would then fix the position of the German ships and then shadow them for as long as necessary before other ships of the Royal Navy could close in and attack. Ellis also knew that the cruisers were essential, and the only real way to track the German ships due to the weather, which made reconnaissance flights impossible for long stretches of time, both because aircraft could not get in the air, but also because they could not actually see anything. Visibility was less important for the Suffolk because it was equipped with two different types of radar. These were the Type 270 air warning radar and the Type 284P range-finding radar, which was the optimal set for tracking the Bismarck, with the only challenge being that it could not be used in a 90-degree arc to the rear of the ship. Although oddly enough, given how important the radars would eventually be throughout the Bismarck chase, it was just the good old human eyeballs that would first spot the German ships as they moved through the strait. At the time, the Suffolk was sailing close to the minefields that had been put in place near the coast of Iceland. Able seaman Newell, one of the lookouts on the Suffolk, spotted some shadows in the mist and fog. Eventually, the profiles of two German ships would come into view. The exact range was a bit fuzzy, but what was clear very quickly was that the German ships were well within engagement range, probably somewhere around 13,000 meters, or about 8 miles. This caused serious concern on the Suffolk. A single shell from the Bismarck could destroy the ship, and so the cruiser quickly turned towards a fog bank and moved towards it at full speed. What followed was the longest 3 minutes in the lives of some of the men aboard the Suffolk, who all had eyes on the German ships, fearing that at any moment they would see the flash of guns and the fall of shells. Lieutenant Commander Collette would write from his position on the anti-aircraft gunnery director, which provided him with one of the best vantage points possible, that he was watching the German ships, quote, slinking along the edge of the ice in a snowstorm, and for some reason they did not fire on us. At that short range, he could have blown us out of the water, end quote. But the German ships did not open fire, and the cruiser made it into the fog between two sections of the minefield. Captain Ellis allowed the German ships to get about 21,000 meters or 13 miles away, right at the edge of the effective range of the 284P radar, before starting to move after the German ships. Of course, a report was radioed out immediately. Quote, emergency, repeat back, 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, bearing 020 degrees in sight, range 7 miles, course 240 degrees, end quote. This would be the first of an almost endless series of course and position messages that the Suffolk would send in the days that followed. This was priceless information that would be sent out to any Royal Navy fleet element that was anywhere close to where the Bismarck was or might be. While the Suffolk had found the Bismarck, the German ships had also spotted the British cruiser. At around 7:22 p.m., an alarm was signaled on the Bismarck because one of the lookouts on the Prinz Eugen had spotted a dim shape ahead, similar to the first sights that the lookout on the Suffolk had of the German ships. Radar reported that the range to the ship was around 13,000 meters, about 8 miles, but the range was increasing as the ships were moving away from one another. One thing that was unclear was exactly what type of ship it was, although it seemed clear that it was some kind of warship given its silhouette. The Germans would also intercept the radio message that was sent from the Suffolk, the same emergency broadcast that I just quoted a moment ago. While this made it very clear that they had been spotted and that the Royal Navy would all know that the German ships were moving through the Denmark Strait, what was not clear was exactly how many ships were in the strait itself and were not in close contact with the German ships, or just who was out there in the fog. Over the course of the following hours, the officers aboard the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen would try and piece together information about the ships that were still on radar and hydrophone, and were still glimpsed from time to time through the fog, to try and determine their type and number. These are the types of situations where our benefit of hindsight is important to unpack and peel away. All that Lutjkins and his officers knew was that it was a British ship. It could be anything, from an auxiliary cruiser to a battleship, and it could be one of many battleships or auxiliary cruisers out there. In fact, a rumor would begin circulating that it was the King George V battleship based on some incorrect assessments made by the radio intelligence group aboard the Prinz Eugen. While the Suffolk was the first to make contact with the Bismarck, it would rapidly be joined by Captain Phillips and his ship, the Norfolk. The Norfolk had been patrolling in a different area, but began making its way towards the expected location of the enemy ships as soon as the contact report was made. The Norfolk had a less advanced radar than the Suffolk, mounting a Type 284M, which was a single set that was used for both air and surface search, but in a more limited way. Instead of a rotating aerial that could search most of the areas in front of the ship, the 284M was fixed to just one point forward, making it less flexible than what the Suffolk had installed. It was also just not as good as the Suffolk's 284P in terms of distance and clarity, and it could detect ships and the information might be available, but the Suffolk would certainly be the primary user of radar. Its radar was just better. These type of equipment differences were often just down to luck around exactly when the ship was built or had its last major refit. The exact performance of the radar was important because it was traveling through thick fog almost blindly to try and come in support of the Suffolk. A small mistake was made during this time, partially due to the radar, and at around 8:30 p.m., the cruiser came out of a fog bank within 10,000 meters or 6.2 miles of the Bismarck. This was a major problem because that was a very close range for the German ships, and unlike when the Suffolk was spotted, the German ships opened fire quite quickly. The Norfolk got lucky and the shells missed, but they hit close enough to the ship that shell splinters would impact and damage the Norfolk's X-turret. The Norfolk put up a smoke screen and quickly moved to widen the range with the Bismarck, with several more salvos from the Bismarck's 15-inch guns falling around the cruiser, any of which could have destroyed the ship if they'd managed to hit it. After the Norfolk had retreated out of firing range, Lutjkins was presented with two problems, both of which did not have easy answers. The first and most immediate was the problems with the Bismarck's radar, and specifically the fact that firing the main guns could cause the radar to no longer work. Well, now it was very clear that that was going to happen quite often. This would be a recurring issue that there was no immediate fix for, although the radar could be repaired after each use of the guns. It was only the forward radar that was a problem, though, which meant the rear-facing radar still functioned. This meant that all that really needed to happen was for the Prinz Eugen to take up the forward position for the German ships, to always be there with its radar, even when the Bismarck had to fire. The German cruiser could keep its eyes forward while the Bismarck kept its focus behind. The larger and more long-term problem was the fact that based on the radio messages that were intercepted and continued to be intercepted, it was clear that the position of the two ships was being reported by the trailing British vessels, and their reports, as far as could be determined, were very accurate. This put the entire concept of the operation at risk because every sortie out into the Atlantic was based on the idea that the German ships could make it out into the wider expanses of the ocean without being spotted by their Royal Navy. The fact that they had not even made it out of the Denmark Strait before being found put everything at risk because it almost certainly meant that other Royal Navy resources were being arranged to meet the Bismarck. This left Lütjens with the option to either abort the operation or to try and engage the British cruisers and to sink them to end their position reports. While the German ships worked together to position themselves to best utilize the strengths of their ships and cover for their weaknesses, the two British cruisers would do the same. They would meet up at 10 a.m. on May 23rd as they continued their shadowing, and they would begin to coordinate their efforts through orders sent back and forth through signal lamps. The two ships were under the command of Rear Admiral Wake Walker, and he understood the limitations of the radar on both ships, which would make it challenging to do what they were trying to do. The biggest issue is that the two cruisers could not risk coming within engagement range of the Bismarck. They had been very lucky in their previous moments of risk, and it seemed unlikely that such luck would continue. This meant that the cruisers would have to turn away if the Bismarck turned to engage them. But in doing so, the radar on both cruisers would become completely unable to track the German ships. Neither could track ships to the stern of their cruisers. The Suffolk was better positioned because it could at least track the Bismarck while sailing at angles away from the Germans, but the Norfolk would be almost useless. As Wake Walker would write, quote, "Should the enemy turn on his pursuers when being shadowed, the shadower must act at once, but in turning away he loses RDF touch astern, and is very liable to get caught or retire too far." End quote. Essentially, his concern is that the British cruisers would be forced to turn away from the Bismarck, but they wouldn't be able to tell when the Bismarck then turned again, maybe going in some other direction, and so they could be caught off guard by that turn and not come back into contact in time. The British cruisers, at this point, were also doing something almost entirely new in the history of naval warfare. Radar was a new invention, and this was the first time it was being used for shadowing an enemy ship for this long a period of time, so they were in many ways kind of making it up as they went along. These problems would immediately be put into stark relief when on the evening of the 23rd, the two German ships would enter into a rain shower, would then increase their speed to 30 knots, and very quickly turn around and head directly towards the British cruisers. The Bismarck came out of the rain, did not see the cruisers, and therefore turned around and moved back towards its previous course. On board the cruisers, they'd been able to detect the German movements via radar, which allowed the cruisers to react before the Germans were able to visually see them again. Visual contact was lost for a period of time, but radar contact was quickly reestablished. For a handful of hours, Lütjens believed that his ships had lost the tailing cruisers, but it was not to be when the cruisers were detected by radar on the Prinz Eugen a few hours later. The Germans would just have to deal with the problems presented by the tailing cruisers, and they could not really do much about it, and they would kind of stop trying. It was a frustrating situation, and all the while they continued to intercept the stream of radio messages that detailed their exact positions. The intelligence that the Germans had, and which had then been provided to Lütjens before he sailed, was that the British were far behind in their efforts to develop radar, but Lütjens would make the assumption that the technology was more advanced than reported because the British were too good at maintaining contact. Having partially given up on the idea of breaking contact, the four ships would just continue along the southwest edge of the ice in a kind of very loose formation as they exited the Denmark Strait. While the Norfolk and the Suffolk continued to shadow the German ships, and they continued to send their stream of position reports, plans for how to deal with the problem of the German ships were being developed at the Admiralty. There were two tasks that had to be considered, and the first was to bolster the protection of the convoys that might be intercepted by the Bismarck. At the time, there were 11 convoys at sea, but only a few of those were in immediate danger. The other task was to find a way to attack and hopefully sink the Bismarck. For these tasks, there were 3 forces available: the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron near Iceland, Tovey's home fleet, and Force H, commanded by Vice Admiral Somerville. The 1st Battlecruiser Squadron, made up of Hood and Prince of Wales, was best positioned to intercept the Bismarck, and it would be tasked with doing so at the earliest possible moment. They would increase their speed to 26 knots, which was basically the top sustainable speed of the Prince of Wales, given the conditions that they were moving through. There was heavy sea at this point in time. The 2 ships would turn off their radars due to concern that their radio emissions would be detected by the Germans, which would prove to not be something that the Germans were equipped to do, but it kind of makes sense that they would be concerned about that. That seems like a reasonable precaution. Admiral Tovey, with King George V, the battlecruiser Repulse, and the carrier Victorious, and a collection of cruisers and destroyers, was southeast of the Bismarck's position, and they would steam west towards an intercept course, although it would take them longer to arrive than the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron. Force H, based out of Gibraltar, would be tasked with moving into position to protect some convoys, instead of actively trying to intercept the Bismarck directly. Force H was also the primary group responsible for intercepting the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau if they left Brest. The British did not know the exact extent of the damage caused to the Scharnhorst during Operation Berlin or the effects of the bombing attacks on the Gneisenau, so they did not know that they were not going to participate in the ongoing operation, but Force H was positioned with the aircraft carrier Ark Royal to make sure that they could not join up with the Bismarck. Now, while all of these groups were important to the overall operation to intercept the Bismarck, it was clear that the most important group, or the one that would be most important the soonest, was the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron, commanded by Admiral Hood. Just after midnight on May 23rd, his ships began to make final preparations for battle. Their white ensigns would begin flying. They were racing to battle, and for almost everyone aboard the HMS Hood, they were racing to their deaths.